James Garner finally tells the truth about Randolph Scott. James Garner is born in the heat of a broken world. April 7, 1928, Norman, Oklahoma, Dust Bowl country. A town where people worked with their hands, fought with their hearts, and trusted no one wearing a suit. That's where he came from. Not Hollywood, not money, not connections. Just raw, honest America. Before he was James Garner, the movie star, he was James Bum Garner, a kid with bruises on his soul. His mother died when he was just 5. His stepmother beat him. He dropped out of high school. And then, he left. Hitchhiked to Los Angeles. No plan, no promises, just guts. Most people remember him from the Rockford Files or Maverick. The cool guy. The man who didn't need to shout to win the scene. But few know the fire that built that calm. Fewer still know what he really thought of other Hollywood legends. Especially one, Randolph Scott. Now why does that matter? Because somewhere in the tangled roots of old Hollywood, there's a story barely anyone talks about. A story Garner hinted at. A truth he maybe tried to whisper, but never fully told. And today, we're going to dig it up. But first, let's talk about Randolph Scott, the man everyone thought they knew. Randolph Scott didn't act in westerns. He was the Western. He had the jawline of a sheriff, the eyes of a man who'd seen too much, and a voice that didn't ask, it commanded. He made over 100 films in his lifetime. Not cameos, not filler. Real, dusty, Gunsmoke classics. But Scott didn't just play cowboys. He embodied a myth. The clean-cut, untouchable, all-American hero. You've seen him, even if you haven't, because every cowboy that came after him was just trying to be him. Clint Eastwood studied Scott. John Wayne respected him. Directors worshipped him. Audiences believed every move he made. But here's the catch. No one really knew who he was. Randolph Scott was obsessively private. Rare interviews, no scandals. He married once, had 2 kids, stayed out of the tabloids. Or so it seemed. But the Whisper Network in Hollywood told a different story. A much different one. There were rumors about his longtime friendship with Cary Grant. The two lived together for years. Some called it a brotherhood. Others called it something else entirely. And just like that, the picture-perfect cowboy started to blur. Was it all an image? Was Randolph Scott hiding something behind that perfect posture and Hollywood smile? And more importantly, what did James Garner know about it? Because long after Scott rode off into the cinematic sunset, Garner walked onto the stage with stories of his own. And one of them, it said, involved Randolph Scott. But what did he say? And why did he wait so long to even mention it? We'll get to that. But first, you need to understand just how deep this rabbit hole goes. Before James Garner ever said a word about Randolph Scott, he'd already built a reputation that made people listen. He wasn't just another actor, he was a walking contradiction. Calm but dangerous. Charming but cutting. The kind of guy who didn't need to act tough, because you felt it in your gut. Born in the Great Depression and hardened by war, literally, Garner was wounded in the Korean War before he ever stood in front of a camera. He didn't go to acting school, didn't chase fame. In fact, he fell into acting almost by accident. But when he arrived, he owned it. From Maverick to The Great Escape, from rom-coms to noir, James Garner wasn't just versatile, he was real. And in a town full of plastic smiles and scripted lies that made him dangerous, Garner was one of the few stars in Hollywood who spoke his mind. About producers, directors, even the entire studio system. He didn't play politics. He walked out of contracts, sued studios, told off executives, and survived. But what made him truly different was what he didn't say. He wasn't the type to gossip, so when he did comment on someone, people paid attention. Especially when it came to old-school legends like Randolph Scott. There are whispers, low volume but persistent, that Garner had things to say about Scott. Things most people wouldn't dare say out loud. Things that maybe he shouldn't have said at all. But let's not jump ahead. First, we need to ask the obvious question. Did James Garner even know Randolph Scott? And what kind of connection did these two icons of American cinema really share? You might be surprised. At first glance, James Garner and Randolph Scott seem like they lived in 2 different Hollywoods. Scott was the old guard, polished, disciplined, always in control. Garner was the new wave, rebellious, loose, sharp-tongued. They never made a movie together. They weren't photographed at parties. They weren't neighbors. So, where's the connection? Here's where it gets strange. Hollywood is a small town, with long shadows. And the deeper you dig, the more you realize, just because two stars didn't appear together, doesn't mean they didn't cross paths. Garner admired the classic Western era. He respected the men who built it. And Scott, he was the blueprint, the silent alpha. But that admiration wasn't blind. In later interviews, Garner spoke about the facades actors built, about how Hollywood legends were often hiding darkness behind charm. He said, some of the biggest names were the biggest phonies. He never dropped names, but some believe that one of those phonies was Randolph Scott. Now here's where it gets really interesting. There's a thread that connects them, not through film, but through people. Garner was close with directors and producers who had worked with Scott. He was friendly with actors who'd partied with both Scott and Cary Grant. And in private circles, over drinks, in backlot trailers, stories get told, stories that never make the press. Some claim Garner heard one of those stories, and it changed the way he saw Scott. Others go further. They say Garner witnessed something personal, something scandalous, something that, if revealed, would have shattered Scott's carefully guarded image. Was it true, a misunderstanding, or just another Hollywood rumor? That's the thing about stories whispered in shadows. You can never be 100% sure. But the question remains, why would James Garner, a man known for discretion, even hint at something like this? And what exactly did he say? The answers, or what's left of them, might be hiding in the next chapter of this mystery. Every mystery has a spark, a tiny moment, a single phrase, or just a look that doesn't sit right. And when it comes to James Garner and Randolph Scott, that spark wasn't shouted from a stage or printed on the front page. It started in the shadows, whispered, half-remembered, passed along between insiders like a guilty secret. So, where did the rumor begin? Where's the first hint that James Garner might have said something about Scott that no one else dared to say? Here's the thing. It wasn't in a press conference. It wasn't in a TV interview. It wasn't even in his best-selling memoir, The Garner Files, at least not directly. But in private circles, off-camera, off the record, Garner was known for being brutally honest. No sugarcoating, no PR script. If he respected someone, he said it. If he didn't, you'd feel it. Some of those off-the-record comments started leaking, slowly. Bits and pieces shared at film schools, inside biographies, or even late-night radio shows. They all pointed to one idea. Garner knew something about Randolph Scott, something that didn't match the public image. And while most of the public was still hung up on Scott's clean-cut, all-American persona, insiders were whispering about what happened behind the scenes. One name kept coming up again and again in those conversations. Cary Grant, the Hollywood golden boy, the man who shared a house with Scott for over a decade. The two were inseparable, living in a beachfront mansion in Santa Monica, often photographed sunbathing together, dressed in matching outfits, laughing like soulmates. Was it just friendship? Was it publicity? Or was there more? That question haunted the studios. And while the official line was silence, the backlot buzz never stopped. Some say James Garner made a comment, just once, that broke that silence. A quiet remark at a party, or maybe on set. The kind of thing you only say when you think no one's really listening. We don't have the tape, we don't have the transcript, but we have the reactions. The shift in tone, the tightening of lips, the awkward glances when Scott's name came up in Garner's presence. And sometimes the absence of words speaks louder than anything else. But let's dig deeper, because if Garner did say something, we'd need to know what and how seriously to take it. Which brings us to the next chapter. Now this is where it gets tricky. You'd think, with the internet, archives, and 100 Hollywood documentaries, someone would have pinned this down already. A direct quote, a source, a recording. But they haven't. And maybe that's part of the design. James Garner wasn't careless. He knew how the industry worked. He knew how reputations were made and destroyed with just one sentence. So if he spoke about Randolph Scott, He chose his words very, very carefully. What we do have are fragmented accounts. Film historian Mark Elliott once claimed that Garner, in a closed-door conversation, described some old-school Western actors as phony. When asked if he meant Scott, he reportedly didn't answer. Others say Garner made passing remarks about how image was everything back in Scott's day, and how some actors were living double lives because they had to. Again, he never dropped a name, but the people in the room knew who he was talking about. And then there's this. A former publicist who worked with both Garner and several of Scott's contemporaries claimed that Garner once alluded to knowing what really went on in that beach house. Again, no proof, no audio. But that quote, that exact phrase, has shown up in two different biographies written years apart. Coincidence? Maybe. Fabrication? Possibly. But when the same sentence floats around Hollywood for decades, people start paying attention. So let's be honest, we may never know exactly what James Garner said about Randolph Scott. But we know this much. He said something. And whatever it wasn't praise. If it had been complimentary, it would have been printed. It would have made headlines. It would have been framed and hung in someone's office. Instead, silence. The kind of silence that makes people lean closer. And as anyone in Hollywood will tell you, when legends go quiet on each other, that's when the real stories begin. But what was it that made Randolph Scott such a mystery in the first place? And why were so many people desperate to protect his image, even decades after his death? We'll go there next. In Hollywood, what people don't say often matters more than what they do. And when it comes to James Garner and Randolph Scott, the silence is deafening. Let's back up. If James Garner really had something explosive to reveal about Scott, something that could have shattered his polished public image, you'd expect one of two things to happen. Either Garner would come out and say it loud, or Scott's estate, fans, or fellow actors would rush to shut it down. But neither happened. No public denial. No confirmation. Just radio silence. Which raises the question, why didn't anyone say anything? Why didn't Garner clarify what he meant? Why didn't someone, anyone, step up to either back him or bury the story? Here's a possibility. Maybe the silence wasn't an accident. You see, Hollywood, especially in the Golden Age, wasn't just about movies. It was about control. Controlling narratives. Controlling images. Controlling the truth. Studios ran like empires. They controlled the press, managed rumors, and cleaned up messes before they made headlines. They created legends and protected them at any cost. Randolph Scott was one of those legends. The strong, silent, morally perfect cowboy. The image of American masculinity. If anything threatened that brand, the system would bury it. Fast. So when James Garner, decades later, even hinted that something about Scott's public image might have been fake, that wasn't just gossip. That was a threat to a myth Hollywood had spent 50 years building. And maybe that's why nothing was ever officially confirmed or denied. Because the truth wasn't convenient. And in Hollywood, inconvenient truths don't disappear. They get buried. But sometimes, they still find ways to resurface. Which brings us to the one part of the story everyone's afraid to touch. Let's talk about the beach house. Because no story about Randolph Scott and the whispers surrounding his legacy is complete without it. For over a decade, Scott lived with Cary Grant in a Santa Monica beachfront mansion. They weren't roommates crashing to save money. They were inseparable. Photos from the era show the two lounging side by side, shirtless in matching swim trunks, smiling like lovers on vacation. They shopped together, cooked together, dined out, traveled, slept under the same roof for years. The press, of course, spun it as bachelor fun. A couple of movie stars living it up. But behind the scenes, the studios were panicking. This was the 1930s and 40s, a time when even the hint of queerness could destroy an actor's career. And Scott wasn't just an actor. He was the ideal American male on screen. So the studio heads did what they always did. They sent in PR teams, crafted fake dating stories, paired both Grant and Scott with women for red carpet appearances. Magazine covers showed them with starlets on their arms, women they were rarely seen with off-camera. And it worked. Sort of. The public never asked too many questions. But those inside the industry, They saw what was really going on, and some of them remembered. James Garner, decades later, would find himself surrounded by that old guard. He'd hear the stories, from makeup artists, producers, set designers, the people who kept Hollywood's secrets for a living. And whether he believed all of them or not, he believed enough to raise an eyebrow when people spoke of Scott's traditional values. There's even talk, whispered of course, that Garner once joked he was the best cowboy on screen. But off-screen, let's just say he didn't ride solo. Is that real or apocryphal? Hard to say. It was never printed, only passed along like an urban legend among industry veterans. But it fits the pattern, because here's the truth. Behind that perfect cowboy image, Randolph Scott was a man living in a time where being yourself came with a cost. And if James Garner saw through the image, even just for a moment, then maybe that's the real reason his words have stuck around so long. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. And in an industry built on fiction, the truth, even whispered, is dangerous. But don't think the story is just about one beach house or one friendship. Because what comes next is where it all starts to unravel. Here's what makes the story hit harder the deeper you go. Randolph Scott wasn't just any actor. He was the living, breathing embodiment of American virtue. On screen, he was a man of honor. He didn't shoot first. He didn't cheat, lie, or stray. He was loyal, tough, and quietly righteous. The cowboy you wanted on your side when things got bad. But here's the catch. That image was fiction. Crafted, polished, protected. And the more perfect a public image looks, the more cracks it tends to hide. Because in real life, Scott was complicated. He grew up in the South, fought in World War I, lived a life that didn't match the cardboard cutout roles he played. He was wealthy, private, distant, and very, very controlled. So when James Garner, decades later, quietly started pushing back against that perfect version of Scott, it wasn't about gossip. It was about truth. Garner was a man who hated phony people. He said it openly. He couldn't stand actors who played one role on screen and a completely different one in life. And when it came to Hollywood legends, he was deeply skeptical. He once said, "Some of these guys were better at acting off screen than they ever were on it." People think he was talking about egos, vanity, politics. But some think, and here's where it gets interesting, he was talking about secrets. Secrets like fake relationships arranged by studios, rumors scrubbed clean from newspaper columns, actors who lived entire double lives to protect their careers. And in that world, Randolph Scott was the crown jewel, untouchable, godlike, flawless, until someone like Garner came along and called out the illusion. But why would Garner do that? Why would a man known for minding his own business risk stirring up something that powerful and that personal? Let's just say, maybe it wasn't about Scott at all. Maybe it was about something bigger, something Garner saw happening in Hollywood, even in his own time. And maybe he didn't want the next generation believing the same lies. Which brings us to what may be the real reason behind his quiet rebellion. Hollywood has a code, not one you read in contracts or studio memos, but a real code. A silent one. It goes like this. Don't talk about what you see behind closed doors. Don't name names. Don't poke holes in the image. Don't lift the curtain. And for most of his career, James Garner followed that code. He didn't gossip. He didn't write tell-all books with scandalous details. He kept it classy, even when others didn't. So why then did he break character when it came to Randolph Scott? Why that subtle shift, that quiet tension, that sideways comment that made insiders lean in and go, "Wait, what was that about?" The answer might lie in who James Garner really was. A man who hated lies. He saw how Hollywood manipulated people, how young actors were pressured to hide their true selves, how reputations were built on fictions, and how sometimes those fictions destroyed lives. And maybe, just maybe, Garner saw in Randolph Scott the first example of a machine that later did the same thing to dozens of other stars. He lived long enough to watch talented people hide who they were to stay bankable, marry people they didn't love to appear normal, die with secrets they were never allowed to share. And maybe to Garner, Scott wasn't the villain. He was the blueprint. A man who lived under the spotlight but never in it. who smiled for the cameras but maybe never got to be real. So when people later talked about Scott as a man's man, the ultimate cowboy, or Hollywood's most honest face, maybe that's when Garner couldn't help himself. Maybe he didn't want to tear Scott down, just the illusion he left behind. And here's the twist. By doing that, even gently, even vaguely, Garner risked everything. Not because people would cancel him, but because he'd broken the code. The unspoken rule that says, let the legends lie. Let the myths live on. Don't touch the past. But James Garner, he never cared for rules he didn't believe in. And once he started pulling on that thread, the whole tapestry of old Hollywood started to look different. What comes next might just change how you see both men, forever. Here's the question nobody likes to ask out loud. Why does it still matter? Randolph Scott died in 1987. His last film came out in 1962. So why are people still so afraid to talk about what might have been going on behind that cowboy smile? It's been decades. And yet, his name still brings a strange kind of tension. You can feel it in interviews with old Hollywood insiders. That hesitation, that sudden change of subject, that awkward laugh when someone brings up the beach house. Why? Because Randolph Scott wasn't just a man. He was a symbol. To a certain generation, he was masculinity. He was strength without cruelty, charm without ego, power without rage. He stood tall in the saddle, fought the bad guys, got the girl, rode off into the sunset. And most importantly, he did it all with dignity. So when rumors surfaced, the kind of rumors that questioned the very foundation of that image, people didn't just feel curious, they felt threatened. Because if he wasn't what he appeared to be, then what else had been a lie? That's the real reason people defend him so fiercely. It's not about Randolph Scott the man. It's about what he represents. Especially to those who grew up watching his movies, who built their idea of manhood around his characters. For them, the idea that Scott might have been living a double life doesn't just challenge his story, it challenges theirs. And that's a hard pill to swallow. It's easier to protect the myth, to say, that's just gossip, to say, we'll never really know, to say, let the man rest. But someone like James Garner, he never cared for convenient myths, especially not when they came at the expense of honesty or someone else's truth. And that leads us straight into one of the most underrated sides of Garner's own story. James Garner didn't just act in Hollywood, he fought it. Not with fists or headlines, but with a kind of quiet, relentless integrity that most people in that industry either didn't understand or couldn't stand. He sued studios. He walked out of contracts when they tried to cheat him. He called out producers, refused fake endorsements, and once said, I don't have a public image. I'm just me. Take it or leave it. And that's what made him dangerous. See, Hollywood loves images. It loves control. It loves a star who smiles on cue and sells the illusion. Whether that illusion is about love, war, or who they really are behind closed doors. Garner, he wanted none of that. He refused to pretend. And he refused to stay silent when he saw others forced to. Which is why, when he made those subtle comments about phony legends and actors living a role even off-screen, it wasn't just gossip. It was personal. Garner had seen what that kind of pressure could do. He'd worked with actors who drank themselves into oblivion to survive the double life. He'd watched people fall apart trying to uphold an image that wasn't real. He even hinted at how close he himself came to losing faith in the entire system. And maybe, just maybe, he looked at someone like Randolph Scott and saw not just a myth, but a warning. A man who spent his entire life trying to be what the world needed him to be, and maybe never got to be himself. If that's what Garner saw, then his quiet rebellion wasn't about exposing a scandal. It was about freeing the truth, about making space for future generations of actors to live without masks, without PR-crafted lives, without secrets that could destroy them. Because for Garner, truth wasn't a threat, it was survival. And that's why his legacy, like Scott's, is more complex, more layered, and more powerful than anyone ever realized. But the story's not over yet. Because just when you think the dust has settled, there's one last question that still hasn't been answered. What if James Garner knew even more than he ever said? He knew more than he ever said. You can see it in his eyes. That sharpness, that restraint. like a man who's measuring his words, not because he's unsure, but because he's decided what not to say. And when the topic of old Hollywood comes up, the fakeness, the cover-ups, the actors who built their entire careers on lies, his tone changes. Sometimes he laughs, sometimes he shrugs it off, but sometimes he just goes quiet. And that silence, it says everything. People close to Garner have hinted for years that he was holding things back, not because he was scared, not even because he wanted to protect reputations, but because deep down he understood something most people never will. In Hollywood, the truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it buries you. So maybe Garner looked at what happened to others, actors who were blacklisted, shamed, or erased, and decided that some truths weren't worth saying out loud. Maybe he believed people didn't want the truth. They wanted the legend. And maybe, just maybe, he realized that telling the full story about Randolph Scott wouldn't change history. It would just hurt people. People who still clung to the cowboy myth. People who didn't want their heroes touched. So instead of blowing the lid off, Garner spoke in code. Hints, nods, carefully chosen words. Enough to be heard by those who were really listening, but vague enough to be dismissed by those who weren't ready. And maybe that was his way of keeping his soul clean, without burning down the house he helped build. But there's one more layer to this that most people miss, because this wasn't just about Scott. It was also about what happened to guys like Garner when they told the truth for too long. Let's make one thing crystal clear. Hollywood rewards loyalty. Not loyalty to people, but loyalty to the system. The image, the brand, the illusion. If you play the game, smile at the right parties, keep your skeletons quiet and your opinions quieter, you get rewarded. But if you don't, if you question the script, if you reject the fake friendships, if you call out the machine, then no matter how talented you are or how beloved by fans, they start to push you out. And that's exactly what happened to James Garner. Think about it. He was a box office draw, a TV icon. The Rockford Files won Emmys. The Notebook made generations cry. He was charming, reliable, deeply respected. But Hollywood never truly embraced him. He was too honest, too resistant, too unwilling to play dumb. Even at the height of his fame, Garner was never treated like a golden boy. He wasn't invited into the inner circle. He was always just outside the velvet rope. And the reason is simple. He told the truth. And Hollywood hates truth-tellers. So when he started making those quiet comments about the phonies, the constructed legends, and the actors who lived behind masks, he wasn't just stirring up gossip. He was shining a light into places Hollywood wanted to keep dark. Randolph Scott was just one part of that. But the bigger picture, it was about every actor forced to fake a life. Every studio that buried a scandal, every career that was ruined just because someone wanted to be real. And in a town built on performance, truth is the one thing more dangerous than a lie. So maybe that's why Garner pulled back. Not out of fear, but out of wisdom. Because he'd seen what happened to those who pushed too far. And maybe he decided he could either tell all of the truth, or he could keep working, keep acting, keep surviving, but not both. And in that choice between truth and survival lies the tragedy of so many Hollywood careers. The truth always costs something, and for some, it costs everything. It's strange, isn't it, that the man who played hundreds of cowboys, who stood for truth and justice on screen, might have spent his entire life hiding. Randolph Scott was the kind of actor audiences trusted. When he walked into a saloon in a Western, you knew the bad guys were in trouble. He had that quiet dignity, that righteous stare, that steel-in-the-spine charisma. But off-screen, there's a growing belief, one whispered for years behind closed doors, that Scott was playing a role he never got to stop playing. That the real man behind the cowboy hat was never allowed to step forward, not in public, not in press, not even, some say, with his closest friends. And if that's true, if Randolph Scott really did live behind a carefully constructed mask, then it forces us to ask the question, was he a hero or a prisoner? And here's where it gets emotional, because if James Garner did know the truth, if he saw through the myth, then his quiet criticisms weren't cruel. They were grieving. A man like Garner, who fought to be honest in an industry built on lies, might have looked at someone like Scott and thought, they didn't let him be who he really was. And maybe that's what haunted him. Not the scandal, not the rumors, but the silence. Because behind all the gossip and speculation is something far more tragic. A man who made millions believe in strength, while never getting to show his own vulnerability. A man who looked fearless on screen, but may have lived in fear behind it. And a man who, even in death, still isn't allowed to be remembered as he truly was. Because the image still matters more than the individual. That's the real heartbreak here. And it's one James Garner, in his own way, trying to reveal. Not with headlines, not with accusations, but with just enough honesty to crack the mask, even if only a little. And yet, one final question remains.